One of the best ways to improve your English language skills is to immerse yourself in the sounds and rhythms of native English speakers. But I know that you only have a limited amount of time to spend learning English. So to help with that, I put together 10 original English stories that were on this channel all together in one video. I've removed all the help on vocabulary and pronunciation. Of course, I put links to the original stories in, so if you want, you can go back and refresh yourself on how to pronounce these words correctly. But this video is just the stories. And that means that you can just press play and listen to them while you get on with other things. Maybe going for a walk, maybe doing housework, or maybe going shopping. Hi, I'm Steve. Let's do this. She wore red. As usual, Pete was the last to leave his office, and he hurried to the lift. He was excited because he was going on a blind date that had been arranged by a colleague. He had been told to meet her at the cafe across the road when he'd finished work, and that he would recognise her because she would be wearing something red. Having got into the lift, Pete had just pressed the button for the ground floor when he heard a voice shout,
"Hold the lift, please."
Hearing this, he quickly placed his foot against the door to stop it closing. A moment later, a woman entered the lift saying,
"Thank you so much. I was frightened I'd miss it, and I've got an important meeting tonight, and I don't want to be late."
As the doors closed and the lift started its descent, Pete noticed that the woman was about his age and really fit. She was wearing a big grey coat under which he could just see the hint of a red scarf. Suddenly the lights flickered and they both felt the lift judder to a complete standstill. "What on earth's happened?" exclaimed Pete whilst pressing the lift buttons again and realising the lift still wasn't moving.
"Try using the emergency phone,"
the woman said urgently. "Good idea," Pete replied, picking up the handset. After a couple of seconds, he heard a voice say, "Hello, Forest Maintenance, how can I help?" Trying to keep his voice calm, Pete answered, "Hi, we're stuck in a lift. It's just stopped working." The man's reassuring voice said, "We have people working to fix the problem at the moment. It should be back to normal in a few minutes." "Thanks," said Pete as he hung up the phone. "What did they say?" asked the woman. Pete was impressed at how unflustered she seemed. He told her that the maintenance man said it should only be a few minutes before they were freed from the lift.
"That's a relief.
She said,
I just can't be late."
Deciding that chatting would help pass the time, Pete mentioned that he also was meeting someone that evening.
"Since moving to the city, I don't have much of a social life,"
She explained.
"My friend has fixed me up with a date. It would be just my luck to miss him."
With a big smile, Pete said, "Well, he'd be a fool if he doesn't wait for such a lovely lady as you." The young woman blushed and said,
"You're such a flatterer."
then added,
"I'm Kerry, by the way."
"Hi, I'm Pete." No sooner had he said that than they felt the lift start to move, making its way towards the ground floor.
"Well, it was lovely to meet you, Pete."
"And it was lovely to meet you too. It's a shame we are both busy this evening. It would be nice to get to know you better," said Pete, who found himself really being attracted to her. But before she could reply, the lift doors opened, and Kerry quickly stepped out shouting,
"I've got to dash. Bye."
"Bye," said Pete with a smile, but she was already out of earshot. He watched as she exited the building, and when he got to the door, he was just in time to see that she had already crossed the road and was entering the same cafe that he had been told to meet his blind date. A couple of minutes later, smiling to himself, he also entered the cafe and saw Kerry sat at a table. She had removed her grey coat, and he could clearly see the red scarf around her neck, which made him smile even more. Pete was just about to walk over when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he saw a smiling woman who said,
"Is your name Pete?"
He also noticed that this woman was wearing a bright red hat. Yes, it is, said Pete, glancing over his shoulder and seeing a man approach Kerry's table. Lost. As I lay on my back in a field, looking up at the sky, two things occupied my mind. Firstly, how bright and twinkly the stars were tonight, and secondly, that no one would ever believe how I got here. The day had started like any other Saturday, with me not getting up until 11 o'clock, and then popping down to the corner shop for a carton of milk and a packet of fags. I know I should give them up, and to be fair, I have cut down to only 10 per day, but I just haven't got the willpower to stop smoking altogether. Back at my flat, I made myself a brew, scoffed a bowl of cornflakes, and then got comfy in front of my computer, ready to try and beat my record for playing Minecraft, my favourite video game. I had just powered it on when my mobile lit up and started vibrating. I glanced at the screen and saw it was an unknown caller, and I nearly didn't answer, but then curiosity got the better of me. Hello? Hi Sam, it's Malcolm from university, said a voice I recognised instantly. Smiling, I replied, Malcolm, I haven't seen your ugly mug in over 5 years. What are you up to these days? Well, after university, I decided to go travelling and ended up in India, where I got a job with a telecoms company. What about you? Taking a quick slurp of my tea, I said, Nothing as adventurous as you, I'm afraid. I'm still working at the bank. The reason I'm calling, Malcolm said, is that I've moved back to the UK and bought a cottage surrounded by fields in the middle of nowhere. I wondered if you'd like to come to the housewarming. Without thinking, I said, Come rain or shine, I'd love to, mate. When is it? I'm afraid it's quite short notice. The party's tonight, he said. Well, I've got nothing on. Just give me directions and I'll be there, I said, glad of a reason to avoid my usual lonely Saturday night of watching the telly. It's a piece of cake to find, he said. Just turn off the motorway at junction 17 and head for the village of Bridgeton. It's a big white cottage on the left-hand side. If you do get lost, just give me a bell. Great, I replied, looking forward to it. Bye. Smashing, see you later, he said as he hung up. At 6 o'clock that evening, I decided to get ready. I jumped into the shower and then, because Sunday is my normal laundry day, I put on my only clean shirt. In no time at all, I had set off, and an hour later, I turned off the motorway where Malcolm had told me. And that's when things started to go wrong. I couldn't remember if he said to follow the signs for Bridgeton or Brinkley, and I chose the wrong one. I drove around and around in circles, but not only was I lost, my phone couldn't get a signal, and to add insult to injury, the fuel warning light started to blink on the dashboard of my car. I was on a narrow country lane, so I pulled over next to a big gate that led to a large field, and I got out. I thought that if I could get on top of the big gate, I might at least get 1 bar on my mobile. So gingerly, I climbed up, and after a couple of false starts, I stood balancing at the very top of the gate, holding my phone high above my head and trying not to fall, when a voice said, The reception's terrible here, isn't it? My heart skipped a beat. All my problems were over. I could ask for this stranger's help, and I could get on my way. Quickly, I turned my head, looking for who had spoken, but I couldn't see anyone. Only a large black horse with a snowy white mane standing nearby in the field. Suddenly, the horse took a step towards me and said, "Do you need a hand?" I was so shocked, I overbalanced and fell off the gate into the field, where I landed flat on my back, winded. The horse came and stood over me. Looking down, he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," I stuttered. "I'm lost." "Where are you trying to get to?" the horse replied in a strong, clear voice. "My friend had just bought a large white cottage that's somewhere around here," I said. "Oh, you must mean Malcolm. His cottage is close by and easy peasy to find. Just drive down the lane until you get to a bridge and then turn left. It's down there on the right-hand side." I staggered to my feet, said thank you, and with a nod of his head, the horse trotted off across the field. Bewildered by the unbelievable event, I got back in my car, and sure enough, a few minutes later, I came to a bridge. To the left was another small lane, and less than a minute later, on the right-hand side, I saw a lovely white cottage. Pulling up outside, I went and knocked on the door, and it was opened by my old university friend Malcolm. "Hi, Tom," he greeted me. "You look a little pale. Are you feeling okay?" "Actually, I'm a bit shaken up," I said. "I've just had the most peculiar experience of my life." "Really? Whatever's happened?" he said, looking concerned. "I got lost on my way here, and I was given directions by a talking horse." Looking puzzled, Malcolm said, "Was it a big black horse with a snowy white mane?" "Yes," I said. "Well, that is very strange," Malcolm replied. "That horse is usually not very good at giving directions." The Titanic. We had stayed overnight in a small hotel in Southampton, England. But even though we had hit the sack early, I had hardly slept a wink due to not only the excitement of starting a new life in America, but also travelling on the newest, biggest liner in the world, the Titanic. My dad told me that it was the best of both worlds because it was not only opulent, but also unsinkable. In hindsight, he was half right. Finally, on the 10th of April 1912, the day before my 12th birthday, I climbed up the gangway, with my mum insisting on holding my hand, onto the deck of the most prestigious ship in the world. I glanced up, and high above me I could see the bridge. Through the window I could see a man dressed in a smart uniform with a white beard. I tugged on my dad's sleeve and pointed, saying, "That man is a dead ringer for Grandad." "He is the spitting image," remarked my dad, laughing. "But I believe that's Captain Smith, and he's in charge of this ship." There was an enormous crowd of people on the dock to see off their family and friends, and I wanted to stay and watch, but Mum insisted we go and check out the layout of the ship. "What do you think?" said Dad when we arrived at our cabin. "There's not enough room to swing a cat in here," complained Mum, "but at least it's only for a few days, so we'll cope." Suddenly, we felt the room and everything in it start to vibrate. "They've started up the engines," exclaimed Dad. "Please, can we go up on deck?" I pleaded. "I want to wave to the crowd, and I think there's a band." "You're driving me up the wall," Mum said, but soon relented, and with no time to spare, we raced up the stairs and were soon leaning on the railing, watching as the port of Southampton and England, my home, slowly faded into the distance. The next day we arrived in France, where we took on some more passengers. It's too bad I didn't pay more attention to my French lessons in school, because I couldn't understand a word that they said. It was all double Dutch to me. We've got one more stop to make before we head off across the Atlantic Ocean, Mum informed me. Surprised by this, I replied, Really? I thought we would be halfway there by now. No, it's a quick stop in Ireland first. It shouldn't be much of a delay. Sure enough, just a short while later we were docking in Queenstown, Ireland. Once the new passengers were safely on board, Dad announced, That's the penultimate stop. The next land we see will be New York, America. I wonder if we'll ever see England again, I thought. But I kept it to myself because Mum and Dad seemed so elated. Our first full day on the ocean was, if I'm being honest, a little boring. I stole a bread roll from the dining room and threw it to the seagulls that followed the ship. But something was puzzling me, so I asked my mum, What happened to all the Irish passengers and those posh people who got on at Southampton? I haven't seen any of them since they boarded. Mum explained, The Titanic has 3 classes of passenger, and they are kept away from each other. The rich folk are first class, and they have their own deck and restaurant where they live high on the hog. We are second class, and the poorer people are in third class, and are mainly in cabins on the lower decks. I was taken aback. I thought this was very unfair, but Mum was feeling a little seasick, so I didn't say anything to her. 3 days later, and it had started to get cold as we strolled around our second-class deck. We even noticed large pieces of ice floating in the distance. They were about the size of a car, and my dad called them icebergs. Most of the ice stays under the water where you can't see it, he said. Shouldn't we slow down then? Said Mum in a concerned voice. My dad just laughed and said, I'm sure the captain knows what he's doing, love. Mum was still feeling under the weather, so we turned in early that night. But just before midnight I woke up because there was a loud groaning sound and everything was shaking. Quickly, get dressed, Dad shouted. I could hear the panic in his voice. What's happening, Dad? I asked, still half asleep. Just do what your father says, my mum snapped. In no time at all, we were fully dressed and standing on the deck. There was a small crowd of passengers who were surrounding a sailor, demanding to know if we were sinking. No, he said. This is the Titanic. It's unsinkable. Hearing this, Mum said, Should we go back to our cabin? To which Dad replied, I think this is going to go south. Let's just wait here for a bit. So wrapped in our heavy coats to protect us from the biting wind, we sat on deck chairs and listened as the ship's band played the latest popular tunes. Suddenly it was bedlam. People, both passengers and crewmen, were running and shouting. We stood up and were caught in the rush. Hold my hand tightly, Mum shouted, taking my hand in a vice-like grip. Minutes later, and my mum was climbing into a lifeboat. When she was seated, my dad hoisted me in as well. But when he tried to follow, a sailor said, It's women and children only in the lifeboats. The company has cut corners, and there aren't enough for everyone. It was obvious that arguing was futile. The lifeboat started to be lowered towards the water, and Mum stood up crying out, I'm not going without you, to my dad, who just smiled and said, It's the last resort. Look after the little one. And with a wave stepped back onto the deck and out of sight. To make a long story short, I never saw him again. The lesson. Last Tuesday, the strangest thing happened, and I learned a valuable lesson that I thought I'd share with you. I was strolling around the shops when I saw an elderly gentleman step off the curb into the road, right in front of an oncoming car. I darted forward and just managed in the nick of time to pull the old gentleman back onto the pavement. He was very shaken up, but other than that, he was unharmed. That was a close call, he said. If you hadn't been here, I would have been a goner. I'm just glad I could help, I replied. As we were outside a cafe, I said to him, "Let's pop in here. I'll buy you a cup of tea. Hopefully that will make everything seem better." "I could certainly do with a cup of tea," said the man, who I later learned was called Graham. "But I'll pay. I insist." A few minutes later, and with steaming mugs of tea in front of us, we were sat having a natter. I quickly realised that Graham was a very wealthy man when he used his mobile phone to request his chauffeur pick him up from the cafe in an hour's time. Being out of work and not having 2 pennies to rub together, I said, "Graham, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you come to be so rich?" "It all started when I was a teenager. I managed to scrape together 50 pence, and I went to the local market, where I bought some apples. I took the apples home and washed and polished them until they shone, and then I stood on a street corner and sold those apples for 75 pence, and the next day I did the same thing, until by the end of the week I had made £3. I listened to the fascinating story of this young entrepreneur. "Please carry on," I begged. "Well, after 6 months," he continued, "selling apples had made me a grand total of £40. He smiled at the memory. "Then what?" I said. "Please continue," wondering if perhaps there would be a similar opportunity for me. "Then," he said, "and this is the most important part," I leaned in, eager not to miss any pearl of wisdom he threw my way. "Then my uncle died and left me £4 million. We both roared laughing until finally Graham's driver arrived and escorted him away. It was then I realised that he'd left me to pay the bill, but I didn't mind. I had learnt a valuable lesson." The Big Hole. "Is that it?" said Elaine, as the family car sped across the border between England and Wales. "What were you expecting? A passport checkpoint?" her husband Mike laughed. "Well, I've never been here before, and I thought there would be a little more than a small road sign saying "Welcome to Wales." A voice from the back seat joined in the conversation. "Are we nearly there yet?" It was their teenage son Kit, who had spent the whole journey so far engrossed in his mobile phone. "It should take roughly an hour," said his dad. Upon hearing this, Kit lowered his head and went back to playing with his mobile. After missing out on their annual holiday for 3 years in a row, first because of the COVID pandemic, and then because Mike had been made redundant, the family were on their way to have a relaxing week's break in the beautiful Welsh countryside. When Elaine had first suggested it, both Mike and Kit had objected, because in the past they'd always flown to exotic destinations like Jamaica, the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, or even once to Goa in India, where they had stayed in fabulous 5-star hotels. But with Mike losing his job, they had to cut their coat according to their cloth, and the family budget just wouldn't stretch to luxury holidays anymore. So common sense prevailed, and Elaine had got a great deal when she booked a small cottage that was next to a large farm right in the heart of Wales. But even though it was a bargain, she still had to dip into their savings. With the help of the sat-nav, they were soon pulling up outside of a picture-perfect cottage. "This looks amazing," said Mike. "What do you think, Kit?" Hardly glancing out of the car window, his son replied, "It looks all right. Do you think it has good Wi-Fi?" With a deep sigh, Elaine turned to her son and in an exasperated voice told him, "We're here for a week to get some fresh air and exercise, not to be stuck in front of a computer screen. Now get out and help your dad carry the luggage in." "Where do we get the keys?" asked her husband. "The email said to knock on the farmhouse door," Elaine replied, looking around. "It must be that big house over there." Without missing a beat, Kit jumped out of the car and shouted over his shoulder, "I'll go and get them." "Typical," said Mike. That boy will do anything to avoid helping me carry the suitcases. But in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail, Kit was back with the keys to the cottage, and they were finally ready to start their holiday. After Elaine had knocked up some sandwiches for lunch, Mike said, "Let's all go for a walk and explore the area." "I'm up for that," said his wife. "Come on, Kit, don't be a wet blanket." "Do I need to put my wellies on, Mum?" he asked, as he finally put down his phone and stood up. "I think we all should," Elaine said, looking out of the window. "It's not raining now, but the forecast is for drizzle later." Suitably dressed, they stepped outside and bumped into an amiable older gentleman wearing a bright blue hat. "Hi, Kit," he said in a strong Welsh accent. Looking puzzled, Elaine and Mike turned towards their son, who explained, "This is Fred from the farm. I met him earlier when I got the keys to the cottage." After they'd all been introduced, Mike said, "We'd better get moving if we want to beat the rain." "If I were you, I'd take the footpath that leads across that big field over there," Fred said, pointing in the direction he meant. "It's a lovely walk, and it's so easy you can do it with your eyes closed." "Cheers, Fred," they all chorused, and with a wave they set off across the field. An hour later, and with the clouds threatening a downpour, with mutual agreement they decided to call it a day. When suddenly Kit said, "What's that?" and made a beeline towards the corner of the field, which was full of long grass and small bushes. When they caught up with him, they all stood peering down into what appeared to be a huge hole that was big enough to swallow a double-decker bus. "How deep do you think it is, Dad?" "I'm clueless," said Mike, precariously leaning over the edge. "It's freaky. I can't even see the bottom." No sooner had he said that than Kit picked up a pebble and chucked it into the hole. They all waited, but it was so deep none of them heard it land. "Try a bigger stone," encouraged Mike, but Elaine was less impressed and wandered off to sit on an old tree trunk that had been cut and left at the edge of the long grass. After several attempts of chucking progressively larger stones in, they still hadn't heard any noise from the bottom of the hole. "Maybe it's bottomless," Mike joked. "Perhaps it goes all the way to China." "I've had enough, and that sky looks ominous. Let's shake a leg," said Elaine, getting up from the old tree trunk she'd been resting on. "Okay, love, let's go," said Mike. But when he noticed what his wife had been sitting on, he got a gleam in his eye. "Kit, give me a hand with this," he shouted, as he bent to lift one end of the trunk. "We should hear this when it hits the bottom of that hole." And after a lot of struggling, with even Elaine helping, they finally heaved it over the edge and into the hole, which was no easy feat. Suddenly, from out of the bushes charged a large black goat, running at full speed towards them. "Look out!" Mike shouted, but they were all too surprised to move and stood stock still like statues as the goat rushed past them towards the hole, and without hesitating it jumped right in. Quickly but cautiously they went to the edge and looked down, but there was neither sight nor sound of the goat. "Do you think it committed suicide, Mum?" said Kit. But she was so shocked the cat had got her tongue, and all she could do was slowly shake her head. Finally, without another word, they all turned and started the walk back to the cottage. When they finally arrived at the end of the field, they ran into Fred the farmer, who looked agitated. "You haven't seen my goat, have you?" he asked. Kit was the first to reply. "We certainly have. We were up in the field by a huge hole, and a big black goat ran up to it and jumped in." "Well, that can't have been my goat," said Fred, "because I used a long piece of rope to tie it to an old tree trunk." The bad news. It was pouring down, and Rachel was made up that she had remembered to bring her umbrella. She'd just finished work and had set off for home. As she walked towards her car, she passed a travel agent's and on a whim popped in. "Hi, "What can I help you with today?" the assistant asked with a smile. "This weather is miserable, and I need to get away for a few days," Rachel replied. "Where do you recommend?" Needing a few more details, the travel agent asked, "What type of holiday are you looking for?" "That's easy," came the quick reply. "I just need a nice hotel, a beach, and lots of sunshine." The travel agent glanced at her computer and said, "Then I've got just the thing." And with a couple more clicks of her mouse continued, "There's a week's stay at a great hotel in Spain that's available. And if you book it today, there's a huge discount." "I like the sound of that," said Rachel, "so I'll book it now so I don't miss the boat." Less than 10 minutes later, and her holiday was booked, and Rachel was in her car, driving home. When she arrived, she was greeted by her elderly grandmother, who she lived with, and Pepsi, her jet black cat. "Did you have a nice day?" her grandmother, who Rachel called Nan, asked. "It was the same old, Nan," Rachel replied. "But I do have some exciting news. I've booked a holiday to Spain." "That sounds lovely. When are you going?" Nan asked. "A week on Monday," Rachel explained. "I'll make sure David looks in on you whilst I'm away to make sure you're okay." Nan looked relieved, as she had been feeling under the weather for the past few weeks, and said, "It will be smashing to see him. These days he only seems to come to visit once in a blue moon." After they'd eaten, and Rachel had fed Pepsi, she gave her brother David a bell. "Hi, David. I booked a week's holiday for a week on Monday. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing, and I was hoping you could look in on Nan and Pepsi whilst I'm away to make sure they're okay." "Sure," replied her brother. "You enjoy yourself, and I'll make sure Nan and your cat are fine. Don't worry." "Great. I'll leave you instructions on how to feed Pepsi." "Seriously, Rachel, I can feed a cat. It's not rocket science." Rachel grinned and replied, "Well, it's good of you to step up. I really appreciate it." The following week, as Rachel sat at her desk in work, seemed to drag, as Rachel daydreamed about her upcoming holiday. She had expected it to cost an arm and a leg, but the travel agent had arranged a huge discount, which meant she would have more spending money while she was there. Although all of her colleagues were a little surprised, as it really wasn't like her to do things at the drop of a hat. Finally, the day arrived, and David had offered to give her a lift to the airport. Rachel was pleased, as it gave her the chance to go over the instructions for looking after Nan and Pepsi with him one last time. 3 days later, and a sunburnt, relaxed and very happy Rachel decided that she should telephone her brother to put her mind at ease that everything was fine at home. "Hi David, it's me, Rachel," she said as soon as he answered. "Oh, hi Rachel," he said. "How's your holiday going?" "It's fantastic. How are things at home?" she replied. "Your cat's dead," David said abruptly. With her heart thumping and tears in her eyes, Rachel said, "Why would you tell me something so horrible in such an awful way? You should have broken the news gently to me." "I'm sorry," said David, who wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. "What should I have said?" "You could have said that perhaps Pepsi had climbed onto the roof, so you went up there after her. Then she got frightened and jumped from the roof into a tree. Maybe you could have said that you called the fire brigade to help get her out. But when they put the ladder against the tree, the cat got frightened and she fell. You rushed her to the vet's, but he couldn't save her and she sadly passed away. That would have been far kinder than saying, 'Your cat's dead,'" Rachel shouted. "You're right, that would have been better," said her brother. "I'll remember that for next time I have to break bad news." "So how's our grandmother?" Rachel asked. David thought for a moment and then said, "Well, she climbed out onto the roof." The big win. I'm pretty ordinary. I'm average looking, I have a run-of-the-mill job, and until a few weeks ago, I had a normal marriage, which makes what happened to me all the more extraordinary. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Robert, but everyone calls me Bob. I live in the city of Nottingham, which is in the centre of England, and of course is most famous as the home of the legendary outlaw Robin Hood. I got married 7 years ago to my childhood sweetheart Sandy, and although like everyone else we've had our ups and downs, I've never regretted it. That is until I came home after a particularly tough day and Sandy dropped a bombshell. I've started seeing someone else. I want a divorce. At first I thought it was a sick joke, but she carried on. I've packed your clothes. I think you should leave tonight. I finally found my voice and said, "Who is it?" Although in my heart I already knew. "It's Zach from work," she replied. This was no surprise to me, as she never stops talking about her new manager, Zach, and how wonderful he is. I remember she once got really annoyed when I made fun of his name, Zach, saying it sounded like something you'd call a police dog. After a brief argument and some tears, mostly mine, I agreed to move out, and I've been crashing with my brother ever since. Of course, solicitors have become involved, and we would already be divorced, except for one big sticking point: money. It's not that we're rich, but we planned on taking a trip across Africa and have been saving up for the last couple of years, putting a little aside every month, and we've built up a nice little nest egg of over £5,500. The obvious and fair thing to do would be to split it in two, but Sandy is insisting that she gets it all, and I've dug my heels in. Which brings us bang up to date, and I'm driving around to what was the matrimonial home to have it out with her. Being low on petrol, I decided to stop and fill up, while gasping at the high cost of fuel these days. I walked into the kiosk to pay and was handing over my credit card when a sign for lottery tickets caught my eye. It said that tonight's prize was a rollover and would be an eye-watering £12 million. So on a whim, I chose to buy one. I needed 6 numbers. The first was easy, my birthday, 22. Then my brother's house number, 18. After this, I drew a blank, so I randomly chose 4, 35, 42 and 9. Once I'd bought it, I folded it up and popped it in my pocket, jumped back in my car and headed for Sandy's. She had insisted that I give her my key, so I had to knock, and when she opened the front door, I saw she was wearing a very posh dress and was obviously dressed to go out. "You needn't have got all dressed up for my sake," I joked. "For your information, Zach is taking me out tonight, so I'd appreciate you just signing this," she said, thrusting a sheaf of papers into my hands. "What are they?" I asked, knowing full well they were the divorce papers. "My solicitor has drew them up," she said in exasperation. "He said if you sign them tonight, agreeing that I keep all of the £5,500, we can go our separate ways and never have to see each other again." "There is no way I'm even entertaining signing this," I said, trying to sound firm, but instead sounding a little whiny. She then turned and started climbing the stairs, saying over her shoulder, "Take them into the living room and read them, whilst I continue getting ready for Zach. We need to get this bottomed tonight." Bloody Zach, I thought, as I went into the living room. That name still sounds like it belongs to a dog. I sat on the sofa that Sandy and I had bought when we first got married and glanced at the papers. They said that if I agreed to give Sandy all of our savings, she would never make any claims against me ever again. I threw them onto the coffee table. There was no way I was signing them. In the corner of the room, the telly was on, with the sound turned down low. The news had finished and the lottery draw had just started. With nothing else to do, I watched as the first ball was drawn. It was 18, my brother's house number, followed by 42, and then my birthday, 22. I fished in my pocket for the ticket I'd bought earlier and confirmed that I had the first 3 numbers. My face broke into its first smile in weeks. I had just won 10 quid. By the time I had looked back up at the telly, another 2 numbers had come out, 9 and 4. Crikey, I'd got those as well. How much do you get for 5 numbers? Maybe a few hundred quid? And now the final number is, said the TV presenter. I watched in disbelief as a silver ball with the number 35 rolled onto the screen. My eyes shot from the television screen to my now trembling hand holding the ticket. 18, 42, 22, 9, 4 and 35. If I checked them once, then I checked them 20 times. I had them. I had all the numbers. From the TV I heard, tonight's lucky winner will win a life-changing £12 million. I wanted to shout at the screen, "It's me, Bob, I'm the lucky winner." But instead I picked up the pen and quickly signed the papers. Gold digger. Dad, she's just after your money. His son's words hurt. Betsy isn't like that, Max, he replied. You might as well know we're getting hitched next month, and I expect you to be there. Max was stood looking out the window at the grand garden of his father's mansion when he said, "No wonder Mum left you last year." "I think you should clear off," his father shouted. "But don't you think it's fishy?" Max pressed. "I mean, her last husband died and she ends up with all his dosh, and now she ends up with you. Doesn't that seem a little dubious?" "She's already told me all about it, and I'm happy that there's nothing to be worried about." Max stormed towards the door, saying, "There's a name for someone like her, Dad. She's a gold digger." His father was about to answer back, but his son had already slammed the door behind him. So he slumped into his favourite armchair and slowly shook his head. He understood his son's point of view, but he knew what he was doing was for the best. A month flew by, and the wedding was due to take place the following day. So Max phoned his father's house to try and reason with him one last time, but there was no reply. Thinking he might be out with his friends, celebrating his last day as a single man, Max tried his mobile number, but again there was no reply. Starting to get worried, Max jumped in his car and drove the short distance to his father's house and let himself in. Or at least he tried to, but something was stopping the door from fully opening. Using all his strength, Max pushed, and slowly the door opened enough for him to squeeze through. A terrible sight greeted him. His father lying on the floor. He was dressed to go out in his winter coat and had obviously collapsed. "Dad!" cried Max. But it was too late. His lips were blue and silent. It was obvious that his father had passed away. Several tearful weeks had passed, and Max consoled himself by going on a spending spree. After all, as an only child, he would inherit his father's fortune. He drove in his brand new Mercedes car to the law office of his deceased father's solicitor to attend the official reading of the will in order to find out what his father had left him, thinking, "Thank goodness Dad died before he married that scheming gold digger." "Max, please accept my condolences for the loss of your father," greeted Mr. Massey. "I was honoured to represent him for over 20 years. "Thank you, I really appreciate that. But can we please get on with it, said Max. I'm catching a flight to Barbados in a few hours. Handing him a sealed envelope, Mr. Massey said, Of course, your father left this letter for you to read in the event of his death. But what about my inheritance? Asked Max. You'll find it all explained in the letter, the solicitor said. Again, I'm really sorry. Max left the office and went and sat in his new luxury car while he read what his father had written. Dearest Max, as you will have realised, unfortunately, I am unable to leave you any inheritance. My company is about to be declared bankrupt, and I have taken out many loans secured against my house to try and bail it out. Your mother's divorce settlement took all of the money I had left. I was introduced to Betsy by a mutual friend, and when I realised that she was an independently wealthy woman, I decided to start a romance and get her to marry me. I wish you only the best for your future. Your loving father. Max dropped the letter and realised he had got it all wrong. Betsy wasn't the gold digger, his father was. Shark. As the plane descended over the Australian coastline, Uncle Dave looked out of the window, unaware that the beautiful blue sea below would not only be the backdrop for his niece Ellen's wedding, but also the scene of a heart-stopping terror. His trip to the land down under had started a month earlier, when his niece had dropped him a line saying that she was getting married. Because she had no other family, she was banking on him to attend and give her away. All of his friends thought he was out of his mind, but he hadn't seen Ellen since she'd emigrated 8 years earlier. So he emptied his savings, booked the flight, and here he was going through passport control. Uncle Dave, he heard as he walked out of the airport, and there was his niece with a huge smile and an even huger man holding her hand. Hi, Ellen. I haven't seen you in donkey's years. Who's this? He asked, indicating the enormous man standing by her side. This is Eric, my fiancé. From the way she said it, it was clear that she was enamoured with him. Eric flashed a smile so bright that it made Dave wish he'd worn sunglasses, and said, Good day, in a broad Australian accent. No disguising where you're from, quipped Dave. An hour later, and after checking into a hotel, the three of them were sat in a bar, discussing the upcoming nuptials. We're getting married on the beach next Saturday afternoon, gushed Ellen. It's going to be very laid back. I'm kicking myself for not visiting you before now, said her uncle. The sea looks so inviting. If you fancy it, I usually go surfing in the morning before work and could teach you, said Eric. Don't I need some gear? Asked Dave. There's a one-stop shop for everything you need on the beach, Ellen said. Then it's decided, said Dave. I'll see you tomorrow morning, but now I'm going to have to hit the sack because I've got jet lag. After they said their goodbyes, Dave went back to his room, but even though he was tired, he found he couldn't sleep. So he switched on the TV and watched the old classic horror movie Jaws until he drifted off and slept like a log. Bright and early the next day, Dave found himself on the beach, practicing jumping on and off a surfboard under the expert eye of Eric. You're really getting the hang of this, said the young Australian. Let's try it in the water. Nervous but excited, Dave picked up his new surfboard and waded out into the surf. They paddled out further than he thought they would, but Eric explained that they had to go beyond the waves to where the water was calmer. Okay, stand up on the board again, instructed Eric. That's easier said than done, Dave spluttered, having fallen off for the umpteenth time. With a shout of, Don't worry, you'll soon get the hang of it, Eric turned his board towards the shore and using his arms started paddling.
Come on, you're ready, follow me. Dave just sat on his board, staring as Eric expertly sprang up and rode a wave all the way to the beach. In for a penny, in for a pound, thought Dave, and tried to copy Eric's technique. Unfortunately, he only managed to stand up for a couple of seconds before plunging into the warm sea. As he swam back towards his surfboard, he noticed a grey shadow beneath the water. His heart started to race as he thought of the movie he'd watched the night before. It seemed that he had come all the way to the other side of the world to become a shark's breakfast. Panic had set in, and even though he tried to keep a stiff upper lip, he found himself screaming for help. The nearest people were sat on a small boat only a short distance away, so Dave struck out, swimming as fast as he could while yelling, "Help me, shark!" But all the people on the boat just seemed to be laughing at his plight. The huge grey monster was now so close it brushed against him, and still he could only hear laughing from the boat. Suddenly Dave stopped as the water in front of him bubbled and a large grey head emerged. This was the end. He closed his eyes and braced himself, when a child's voice said,
"Are you all right, mister?"
Opening his eyes, he saw a young boy, aged about 9 years old, dressed in a grey wetsuit.
Visitors from space. The 1st of April 1998 was much like any other day. I picked up my friend George and joined the rush hour traffic into London. If I remember correctly, we were chatting about football as usual. But then everything changed. Don't get me wrong, Arsenal aren't exactly rubbish, but they won't ever... George's voice tailed off. As I was in heavy traffic and hardly moving, I looked over and saw my friend staring out of the side window of the car. I followed his eye line and looked up into the early morning sky. "Do you see it as well?" asked George. "What the bloody hell is it?" I said shakily. "It looks like a..." "It's a flying saucer," shouted my friend. "I can see it as clear as a bell." For a few seconds we stared out of the window, completely gobsmacked. Then quickly I looked back at the motorway and saw that all the other cars around me had come to a complete stop. So I slammed my brakes on as well, turned off the engine, and on wobbly legs we both got out of the car. We joined others who were stood on the hard shoulder. The crowd of people were mainly silent, except for those expressing their disbelief at the strange sight in the sky right in front of them. "It can't be real. What on earth is it? Do you think it's dangerous?" The craft was round and about the size of a tennis court. It had a row of flashing lights that blinked on and off every few seconds. But most of all, I remember it made absolutely no noise whatsoever. Slowly it approached us, getting closer with every second, until suddenly it stopped in mid-air, and we all watched open-mouthed. A hush fell over the crowd as we saw the UFO begin to descend into a neighbouring field. My attention was drawn to a nearby lane where I saw a police car racing towards the spaceship. When it was about 50 metres away, it screeched to a halt. 3 burly bobbies jumped out and seemed to be having a discussion between themselves. I guess they were trying to decide what to do next. After all, it's not every day that you get called out to deal with a flying saucer. Eventually, a single police officer approached the craft, and I saw he had his truncheon in his hand. Of course, the British police don't have guns, but I bet he wished he did. "He's a braver man than me," I whispered to George. "I'm only standing here, and I'm shaking like a leaf," he whispered back. "There's no way I'd be going any closer." We watched with bated breath as the bobby got to within just a few metres, when suddenly a large door on the front of the craft started to open. As it did, white smoke poured from the inside, curling around the edges of the door. Finally, the door was fully open and resting on the grass at the feet of the brave policeman. Although it was still early morning, the sun had risen, and we could clearly see a small figure appear in the doorway. It was dressed in some sort of uniform, and it was definitely not a human. We were too far away to hear if it said anything, but we certainly saw the copper legging it as fast as he could back to his mates. Just a couple of moments later, another figure appeared behind the creature in the doorway. This time it was a human, a man of average height with a grey beard. Someone in the crowd yelled, "That's Richard Branson." "It bloody is," yelled another. We surged forward, and sure enough, it was the world-famous billionaire, Richard Branson. It turned out that it was all an elaborate April Fool's Day prank that he'd created. The flying saucer was a specially designed hot air balloon, the smoke was made with dry ice, and the creature was a small actor wearing a mask. Apparently, not only had the police been called out, but also the army, and later Branson was hauled over the coals. But it was certainly a day for me and George that was out of this world. For another out of this world English lesson, click on this link. I'll see you next time.